Let's take a little look at the Guardian arming sword from Krieger Armory, USA. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So I have had this arming sword. It is intended for HEMA. So this is blunt, it is flexible, it has a safe tip. More about that in a second. And I have had this actually for a few months now. I've been using it for training, and it was also my chosen weapon to go on the field at the reenactment of the Battle of Tewkesbury. Now that might be quite an odd thing to do. You might say, Matt, why would you take a HEMA sword onto a reenactment battlefield? Well, quite simply, and this might be controversial for some people, it's because HEMA training swords, for the most part, I believe, are better reenactment swords than most reenactment swords. Why? Because they are safer in the thrust, because they flex, they've usually got safer tips on them, and of course they're blunt, because we use blunt swords just like reenactors do, and more importantly, they are, compared to a lot of reenactment swords out there, maybe not all, but most of them, these feel and handle like a real sword, which unfortunately lots of reenactment swords absolutely do not. There's a culture, a tradition, which comes from the past, of reenactment swords in particular, and other reenactment weapons as well, being overweight. Now, some people might argue this makes them more durable. I would argue this often makes them less safe. So, from my point of view, I actually own some reenactment swords. I used to dabble in reenactment, and I do again now. And I looked around at the swords I had available. I thought, do I use one of these reenactment swords? Do I use one of my HEMA training swords? I looked at them all, and this was my choice for a number of reasons. First of all, it seemed the lightest, safest in terms of flex and the tip and everything else options. Also, it didn't have a rolled tip, and therefore, and this is an interesting detail, it meant that I could wear it in a scabbard. So one of the problems with some tips on HEMA weapons, this has a flared tip and we'll look at that in a second. One of the problems with HEMA tips is often you can't put them in any kind of scabbard unless you specifically make a large fat tube, but you couldn't put them in a traditional looking scabbard. This type of tip is safe, but nevertheless is small enough that it will go into a leather scabbard, which is what I happen to use. But you could make a wood-lined scabbard that would accommodate that as well. Additionally, and this is a very important point that you should pay attention to, I chose the Krieger Armory sword because from using it for HEMA training and from other people's observations, you know, people out there, I won't name names, but people out there trading, particularly in the USA and Canada, using Krieger Armory's weapons, I know them to be very well made, very durable, very tough, and that's been my observation as well. Now, I'll just put this sword down for a second. I particularly know that because I have previously reviewed this, which is the Sentinel longsword, and this is one of my favourite longsword simulators to use for longsword classes. Now, I teach longsword on a regular basis, usually once every 2 weeks because I alternate with other systems, but I have used this absolutely loads, and I have not even touched it once with a file on the edge, and it's still completely smooth. I can, hand on heart, because I use this against other manufacturers like Coveton or Reginier or various other makes we've got in the club, I can hand on heart say that this is good steel. I have had no issues with it taking a set or a bend, and I have had virtually no marks whatsoever to the edges, to the blunt edges, and very little marking. I mean, so you can see it's got some little scratches on the surface from use on the flat, and that's usually from burrs on other people's swords. So if another person's sword has got some burr on the edge, it will scratch the surface of the flats of your blade. So this has been incredibly durable. Everything's absolutely rock solid. I've actually got, you can hear it rings. There's an anvil I'm hitting down here, if you're wondering what I'm hitting, an anvil. So it rings, everything is rock solid tight, no movement in the grip, no shrinkage of the grip, none of the cord wrap on the grip has come loose or got damaged. Pommel solid, crossguard solid, it's absolutely standing up fantastically. Now, I'll put this down because I've already done the review of this, but you can, I suppose, if you watch that review, so this is the Sentinel longsword from Krieger Armory, you can take this as a further kind of stamp of approval from me after using it for many weeks of training. It's good, right? So let's move back to the arming sword, which is called the Guardian. Now, before I go on, one thing I want to mention that I might have put in as a slight criticism, but I'm not going to do because I fed that back from the Sentinel review, and they've actually changed the parameters slightly on this model, and that is to do with the fullers. So one of the things that I find aesthetically ugly, nothing to do with effectiveness or durability or anything like that, but aesthetically ugly, is that this fuller is the same thickness, or width rather, all the way up, but the profile tapers. So while the blade tapers down, the fuller is the same width at the base as here. Now, that's something quite common on replica swords, because in the modern world, fullers are put in with a CNC or grinding machine that basically is of one width and puts the fuller in the same width all the way down. However, historically, fullers were initially usually hammered in, and then they were usually ground in with a type of grinding wheel, or sometimes with hand files. And usually what we find is the fuller tapers down as the blade tapers down. The reason why aesthetically to the eye this is quite noticeable is because the fuller being the same width, as the blade gets thinner, it gets closer and closer and closer to the edge. And to my eyes, it looks weird having the fuller so close to the edge. However, Krieger have actually now tapered that fuller. So they took the feedback from my previous video, amazing, and they have enacted it, they've put that into operation, and now they have a slightly tapered fuller. That's great. There's also something about the cross section of that fuller. It is quite flat bottomed, so rather than it being gutter shaped like you would get from a standard grinding wheel, for example, which has got a sort of semicircular section, this is fairly flat. Now, that's actually a good thing for a training weapon, because what that means is you keep a maximum amount of meat at the middle of the blade, but you actually remove a maximum amount of mass towards the edges. Why is that good? Because this is a blunt. So one of the things you have to say at the outset is when you make a blunt sword, you can't, or rather you shouldn't, and don't necessarily want to make the blade in exactly the same way as you would make a sharp blade, because you're making a blunt blade. So because the blade is going to have meat at the edges, because you want it to be blunt, you don't want to be cutting people with it, and you want those edges to be durable, you want to make the cross section slightly different. So this is exactly what Krieger Armory do and did. They set out from the outset to make a weapon that was good as a training weapon. Durable, safe, all of those things. Flexes in the right way, handles in the right way. And they've achieved it. And to achieve that, you sometimes have to make slightly different decisions about the design compared to making a sharp, and they've done that. Right, so first up, the flex on this is good. It's flexible. It's more flexible than, for example, the Regnier arming swords in our club. A number of people in the club do sword and buckler with Regniers. I do sword and buckler with either this, or I do sometimes use a Kvetten as well, which is a slightly different design of arming sword as it happens. And both the Kvetten and this Krieger Armory sword are more flexible than the Regniers that we have in the club. You might prefer a stiffer blade for various reasons, or you might prefer a more flexible blade. Personally, I want a blade to be stiff enough so that in the bind it is still effective in the bind, and it doesn't wobble when I waver it around. This doesn't wobble. Even if I just smack it on the side, it comes back to still pretty quickly. So it doesn't wobble very much. It's nice and nimble, it's light towards the tip, and it's got a fair amount of flex. I've never had any problems with this being overly stiff in the thrust, but equally I've not had any problems with it being too wobbly. The edge durability, just like the longsword, and I haven't used this as much as the longsword. The longsword's been used much more heavily, but the steel appears to be excellent and super hard. It is completely smooth on the edges, despite the fact I've used this in both HEMA and reenactment contexts. It is completely smooth to touch. I've got bare hands, and there is not. I can feel slight scoring up here where it's clearly hit things. I'm not sure whether that was armour or buckler or a crossguard or something. But as you can see, I'm repeatedly rubbing my hands over it, and with no issues. It's very hard steel. The tip is a flared tip, which, if you're a regular viewer of my channel, you will know I'm actually not the world's biggest fan of flared tips. Some people in HEMA, we are divided into two, those who prefer rolled tips and those who prefer flared tips. I, being completely honest, I'm a person that prefers rolled tips, okay? Putting that completely aside, for a flared tip, this is completely fine. I do use flared tip swords. I use the Krieger Armory longsword, which has a flared tip. I've had feathers with flared tips of various manufacturers. I've got a rapier that I've been using for years, which has a flared tip, a Denelli. And this has a flared tip, and I'm happy to use this as well. I prefer rolled tips for various reasons I won't go into here. I have covered it in previous videos. But for a flared tip, this is absolutely fine. Perhaps the only very, very slight sort of criticism is, I would say, this is quite square, and where this flares up here, it does leave a little bit of a striking corner here. Now, this is one of the things that you can actually have a problem with flared tips or roll tips, is that that is a focus point. So if you're hitting someone, particularly if for some reason this really hurts on the thighs, if you catch them with a tip cut on the thigh, that focuses that energy right onto a little corner there. I personally think that it would be better to have a little bit more rounded, so it kind of gradually came out and then was rounded, and this wasn't quite so square at the end, but just a little bit rounded, and it was all a bit smoothed off. So I'd rather see more rounded angles. That being said, this isn't unusual in a HEMA context. You get loads of swords with that kind of shape and angulation, and we don't get loads of injuries from them. So long as you're wearing the appropriate equipment for steel sparring, it's not usually a problem. So it's a really, really minor point. So blade, great quality. Design, very, very good. Edges very hard, nice and safe, nice and blunt. Distal taper, there's not a huge amount, but there is some. So I made some slightly inaccurate statements previously about the longsword when I went and measured it. I thought that there is distal taper. So when you take the profile taper, if we call it that, and when you take the slight distal taper here, it does mean that when I flex the blade, you can see, just trying to push accurately there, you can see it does flex from about the middle of the blade upwards. So it's not that all of the flex is in the last third of the blade, it does flex fully throughout this half of the blade, which in some ways you could say helps preserve the foible of the blade and means that it doesn't get overstressed up here. It spreads out that flex a little bit more evenly through the blade, but it doesn't bend down, here, so the fort of your blade from the guard for about the first foot or 12 inches is, to all intents and purposes, although literally speaking there is a slight amount of flex in there, I'm sure if you measured it, but to the eye and to the feel, it feels very, very rigid for about the first third of the blade. Then you get some flex in the middle third of the blade and more flex in the end third of the blade, which I would say is just about right for a HEMA training weapon. Now the hilt, the characteristic guard, this is this twisted iron feature. This will be mild steel, but this twist style that they've chosen for Krieger Armory is quite characteristic. We can see it on the longsword as well. It's quite characteristic of their design, and it means that when you see one of these in use, it helps you immediately recognise the manufacturer of these. You're like, oh yeah, that's a Krieger Armory, I recognise they do that. There are other makers that do that, but this is something Krieger have really set on. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of the twist aesthetically. I would probably prefer a guard that was just more straightly tapered without the twist, but it doesn't bother me, and it's certainly not functionally any problem. I would say personally that the crossguard seems a little bit on the long side for this arming sword for its proportions. It just looks rather longer than you'd normally expect it to be. I'm only talking about maybe a centimetre off each end of the guard, but that somehow geometrically seems to work better in my eyes. But that's completely personal, and obviously functionally, actually having a longer guard actually provides more protection to your hand and your arm. So functionally it's no problem at all. I'll talk about the grip in a second. The pommel, nothing really to say about that, nothing negative, or it's well made, it's well milled, however it's made. It's parallel in this direction, it's perfectly circular in this direction, and it is peened at the end, so it's a peened construction. It has been rock solid, nothing's come loose. It doesn't interfere with the hand, it doesn't hurt the hand, it's just about the right size and shape. I like it. It could maybe be a little bit flatter and a little bit wider. I think that would maybe look slightly more attractive, but you know, your mileage might vary. Again, that's an aesthetic choice. Now the grip. The final thing to say is the grip. The grip is a nice shape. It is flatter than it is wide, so it gives you good edge alignment, and it's got very slight angular flat faces to it, facets almost, and it is cord wrapped and then I think kind of almost lacquered or varnished, which makes it sort of waterproof, I think. It feels very nice in the hand. It's smooth, but it's grippy. So you'll notice that it has that ribbed cord structure, which means that your hand doesn't slide down it, and it does work well with leather gloves. So absolutely it gives you a good grip and is strong and tough and hasn't, you know, come loose or doesn't have any creaks or anything like that. I'd also say, and this is obviously a subjective thing and something you can probably change, I really like the colour. I really like this has got a green grip. I don't think I own any other swords with a green grip, but it stands out and is quite, it's a nice colour green. So it looks good, it feels good, it works well in terms of strength and integrity. I only have one real constructive or slightly negative thing to say, and that is for my hand, it's slightly on the narrow side. Now, funnily enough, I most noticed this, so I mentioned right at the beginning of this video that I had used this in a reenactment context. I don't have my gauntlets around to hand, but when I'm wearing my gauntlets, the smallness of the grip becomes more exaggerated than when I'm wearing just leather gloves or rather kind of you know, sparring gloves in a HEMA context. And I must say that personally for my hand, although the grip is flatter this way than it is wide that way, it's a little bit on the small side for my hand. Now, I haven't got enormous hands, but I have got fairly long fingers. I'm 6'1", so I'm not small, you know. I normally in a t-shirt would take an L or an XL, so you know, I'm slightly above, I'm bigger than average, and to me the grip is just a little bit on the small side. I personally would prefer to see the grip just a little bit wider here and with a bit more of a swell in the middle. So the grip at the moment kind of goes straight and then it tapers down. I'd rather see it a little bit fatter at the middle here, a bit fatter at the bottom where it meets the guard, and even a bit more fat towards the middle and then swell down, because I think that would sit inside the larger hand, and also it might help with certain types of gloves as well. I think it would just help you index the blade. I do find sometimes a bit of turning of this sword. Now, you can mitigate that by putting your thumb against the inside flat of the guard, but some people wouldn't want to do that for safety reasons. Some people prefer to put their hand lower down on the sword grip because then you get a bit more protection from the cross guard, and it means you're less likely to be hit on the thumb as well. So depending on how you hold the sword, again, your mileage might vary, but what I would say is if you put the hand lower down on the grip, then you're now holding an even narrower part of grip, and the turning problem might become even worse unless you anchor down onto the pommel, like with a Viking sword, in which case it's not going to turn in your grip, but just bear in mind you are now just holding the end, you're further away from the point of balance, and so it will affect your control. Incidentally, on the point of balance, there's nothing, I didn't mention it because there's nothing really interesting to say about it. It's not particularly closely balanced to the hand. It's not balanced far up the blade either. This sword, incidentally, in terms of how it hits, it actually does hit with a fair amount of force. So one of the weird things with arming swords I found over the years is, despite what a sword might look like and feel like in the hand, how they actually hit doesn't always correlate to what you expect. And this sword looks quite narrow when you look at it like this. So it looks like it's going to hit quite lightly, but I've got swords which are the same width as this, but don't hit with quite as much force as this. I'm not exactly certain why that is. It might be to do with the flared tip, it might be to do with the nature of the digital taper. I just don't really know. But what I can say is this sword does actually hit with a fair amount of authority. So buyer beware, or rather user beware, you know, caution required. These can, despite the fact it might look like a little arming sword and not as big and beefy as a long sword or a messer or whatever, you can still hit really, really hard with these, and this can hit certainly as hard as the heaviest sabres that we use in sparring. So overall, another fantastic product from Krieger Armory in the USA. top quality. So I think what you're really paying for with these, apart from the fact that they are very specific designs and Krieger has got fixed in their mind how they think a HEMA training sword should be, and they have gone with that, and this is distinctively their own product and really, you know, thought about a lot, is you're getting very, very good materials and heat treatment. It's unquestionable. Whatever you may think about the design of the sword and little details like the grip or the crossguard or whatever, the fact is that it's very clear to me that these are very well made. Like I did with the longsword, that absolutely rings, and this has been used a bunch in different contexts, and that is a solid steel anvil. It rings like a bell. This guard is rock solid on the tang, the pommel is rock solid on the tang, the grip hasn't contracted or, you know, it certainly hasn't split or been damaged or anything like that. There's just no movement. This thing's a rock. The steel's super hard. Just everything seems super strong about this, and I can imagine people having these Krieger swords and them lasting for years and years and years. They're built like tanks, but they don't handle like tanks. They actually handle really, really nicely, and that's why I have chosen it so far for all of the uses I've put it to. So there we go. Go and check out the link below. Obviously, I'll put a link to this product straight to Krieger Armory. Thanks again to the team there for sending these swords to me, and also giving me updates like about the fuller detail. And isn't that great that they actually, you know, they respond to this kind of constructive feedback? I didn't expect that, honestly, and that's quite admirable, because I know with manufacturers, because I work with a bunch of different manufacturers, that sometimes getting them to make even small changes can mean a big thing for them, because what you think is just a small thing actually makes a big difference in their workshop or their factory, or retraining people. It can actually be quite a big consequence for them. So I never take these things lightly, and that is a massive thing that they are listening to this kind of feedback. So anyway, check out the link below. Thanks again to Krieger Armory for sending this. It's a fantastic sword, and I fully expect that this will be in my hands and being used for probably decades to come, because it seems like it's pretty much indestructible for the things that I'm going to use it for anyway. So a great sword, very useful. I can wholeheartedly give my endorsement to this as an arming sword for HEMA practice, and possibly even for reenactment practice as well, based, you know, depending on the type of reenactment use you might be putting it to. But yeah, it's certainly built strongly enough. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.